Slowly, they pushed Galileo towards his fate. There were violent arguments about whether shape was the deciding factor in keeping an object afloat, and Galileo fell victim to his own fiery character and inability to put up with fools. He began to expostulate theories that were wildly inaccurate, ranting about fire atoms that could pass through solid matter. This vitriolic side to Galileo was what many hoped would prove his undoing. They were wrong, and it was only by corrupt, underhand means that they could finally trap him. The rupture came with the discovery by the German Jesuit Father Christoph Scheiner of mysterious sunspots, black clusters of spots on the sun's surface. When Galileo asserted, probably rightly, that he had observed them first, he tipped himself into a controversy as hot as the sun itself. Scheiner was enraged by the accusation. Typically, Galileo entered the fray as only he knew how, with all guns firing. Ludovico della Colombe set the trap and waited for Galileo to take the bait. It was done with one question: is a moving earth contrary to the scriptures? Now, too late, Galileo saw the flaming sword that guarded the church's authority turn towards him. For a short time, turning the tables once again, he reined in his anger, and with searing intelligence took the wind out of Colombe's sails with a brilliantly crafted letter in his defense. The Bible, he said, should not be used by one philosophical school to beat another over the head. In December 1614, the black cloud burst with a ferocity that not even Galileo's delighted enemies could have foreseen. A Dominican, Tommaso Caccini, stood before his congregation and preached that mathematics was the work of the devil, and that mathematicians should be banned from Christian countries. Ideas of a moving earth, proclaimed Caccini, were tantamount to heresy, and the punishment for heresy was to be burned alive at the stake. Galileo's ideas were no longer safe to hold. Everyone knew of the Dominican Giordano Bruno, who had insisted on holding to the Copernican theory of a static sun. He had been denounced to the Inquisition, probably tortured, and burned alive at the stake. Such was the punishment for heresy. It was not in Galileo's nature to stand idly by and allow the world to be jolted backwards by the rancorous outburst of one priest. Yet the Dominicans were close to the holy office of the Inquisition. How could he turn the sword from his throat and retain his scientific integrity? He began to feel afraid. In 1615, Galileo was summoned to appear before the Pope in Rome. Copernicus's book, expounding the heliocentric theory, had been suspended for correction, a term which meant that the sections considered heretical were to be removed. Galileo was to be brought before the Pope and warned that he should abandon the theory. Aware that failure to do so meant a condemnation by the Inquisition, Galileo determined to go through with the meeting, accept the warning, and thenceforth check his temper and wait for a more opportune time to push his beliefs forward. This was not enough for Galileo's enemies, who wanted him not just silenced, but out of action for good. Adversaries in high office did what all corrupt authorities do. Almost fatally for Galileo, they forged the document recording the meeting with the Pope and placed it in the Vatican archives. Later, it was to lead him to within a hair's breadth of the flames. Galileo, the document now recorded, had been commanded to relinquish altogether the said opinion that the sun is the center of the world and immovable, and that the earth moves, nor further to hold, teach, or defend it in any way whatsoever, verbally or in writing. As far as Galileo was concerned, however, the poisoned cup had passed, and he turned to scientific experiments once more. His interest in optics led him to the invention of the microscope, and he was preoccupied with measuring the speed acceleration of falling objects. But the controversy rumbled on. He could not keep his mouth shut when he was challenged, and in his writings he was unbeatable, a master of prose, satirical, clear, and as sharp as a razor blade. When Galileo's friend Matteo Barberini became Pope Urban VIII, the future looked full of promise. But how deceived he was in this view, Galileo was soon to find out. In 1632, when Galileo was in his mid-60s, the dialogue of the two great world systems, a three-handed discussion on all the points Galileo wished to champion, was finished. It was an attempt to bring his theory of a moving Earth back in triumph, and it was a masterpiece.
For Galileo, the existence of tides was the evidence he was looking for to demonstrate that the universe really was Copernican, that the Earth moved and the sun was stationary. As it happens, his theory was completely wrong, but nevertheless he believed that he had the evidence that he needed. In essence, Galileo's theory was that as the Earth rotated, it created zones of acceleration and deceleration which affected the oceans and therefore created the tides. Ironically, he rejected what we now consider to be one of the real theories of the tides by rejecting the influence of the moon. And he did that because he was an opponent of astrology, and to him the influence of the moon on the tides, which had been claimed as long ago as the time of Aristotle himself, to Galileo it smacked of astrology and occult forces, which he would have no truck with because that was not in the spirit of observational science for which he was standing.
Galileo had miscalculated badly and brought the roof about his own head. Pope Urban was furious at this openly defiant act. The Jesuits, releasing years of resentment, did all that they could to stoke his anger. The book was suspended and underwent an examination. When Galileo received the result, he was, perhaps naively, totally dumbfounded. The dialogue was deemed to be unacceptable to the Church. But worse was to follow. Urban called in the Inquisition. Galileo's situation had become deadly serious. Galileo was in a state of shock when the Inquisitor at Florence called at his house with a formal summons. It demanded that he present himself at Rome within 30 days to answer charges that were to be brought against him. Then came the news he had feared. Galileo was to be put on trial for heresy. In Rome, there followed a series of hearings and interrogations that were to test Galileo's beliefs and intelligence to the full. As before, ill as he was, he argued with skill and brilliance to try and outmaneuver his detractors. But this episode was to bring him to his knees. This was no time for satirical prose. He was fighting for his life, for his honor, for the truth. From the archives of the Vatican came the forged document, commanding him not to hold, teach, or defend the Copernican theory in any way. Galileo protested that the document did not portray the facts correctly, but it was a useless effort. The dialogues clearly went against the instruction. There was no way out. Friends begged Galileo to plead guilty, swallow pride and vanity, admit to having forgotten about being told to drop the theory of a moving Earth, and stay alive. His life rested in his own hands. How would he decide?
There's been a lot of exaggeration about the Inquisition. Their favoured method was simply to tire out the people that they were questioning. They would keep them up, they would deprive them of sleep, they would fire questions at them to break down their resistance. A technique, incidentally, which is used by security forces the world over in the 20th century. So I don't think that the idea of using these horrible instruments of torture is necessarily accurate, and I certainly don't think that they use those kind of methods with Galileo, because again we've got to remember that Galileo was the friend of popes and the friend of bishops.
Galileo had a clear choice. Was truth worth dying for? Should he endure imprisonment, torture, and being burnt at the stake for his scientific beliefs? Should he sacrifice himself for the principles that he knew to be right? Did he, after all, possess the courage for scientific martyrdom? With the flames dancing in his mind's eye and the screams of other heretics ringing in his memory, Galileo appeared once more before the Commissary General of the Inquisition and his assistants. The proud, arrogant seeker for truth was forced to confess his alleged sin. His humiliation was complete. Having confessed, Galileo now hoped for a mild sentence. But his erstwhile friend, the Pope, wanted vengeance. He wanted to destroy Galileo. The sentence was harsh. On his knees, he waited, an old and broken man, trembling in fear beneath the long robe. His prison sentence was confirmed, as was the banning of his book. Then came the hardest part of all for the proud genius. I, Galileo, son of the late Vincenzo Galilei, Florentine, aged 70 years, have been pronounced by the Holy Office to be vehemently suspected of heresy. That is to say, of having held and believed that the sun is the center of the world and immovable, and that the earth is not the center and moves. With sincere heart and unfeigned faith, I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies. Stupidity, fear, the greatest enemies of truth, had triumphed. The scientific movement in Italy crashed to a standstill. The relief when he was allowed to return to Florence, and not imprisoned after all, was marred by another bitter blow to the old man. His beloved daughter, Maria Celeste, whose daily correspondence had always comforted him, died in the spring of the following year. Galileo was heartbroken. It seemed he wished for nothing more than to join his daughter in death. But Galileo's fighting spirit could not be crushed. Within a short time, a visitor wrote that Galileo and his friend, a man called Piccolomini, were spreading papers all over the floor with such excitement that one could not weary of admiration. At the age of 69, he published Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Concerning Two New Sciences. Far from being broken, he was once again on the attack, with Aristotle as the whipping boy. It was another brilliant work, touching on his favorite topic of motion and acceleration, engineering and the philosophy of science. One phrase, any velocity once imparted to a moving body will be rigidly maintained, remains one of the foundation stones of physics to this day, proving how advanced Galileo was in his thinking. But finally, when his eyesight failed and he became blind, he could no longer continue his experiments. The bright light of his piercing, abrasive genius flickered and was extinguished. Galileo, the scourge of the narrow-minded and ignorant, died in 1642.
Galileo's main legacy was as part of the 16th century and 17th century scientific revolution. Galileo himself was an empiricist. He could prove things by looking at the real world, and this sets in a whole new era in science, leads up to Newton, and indeed leads to all the scientific discoveries of the present day.
The importance of his work, the principles he established in mathematics and mechanics that affect our lives today, is acknowledged now some 440 years later by the American space agency NASA, as the Galileo space probe pushes ever wider the borders of scientific knowledge, just as he did.